Those cattle were supposed to be gone before you arrived. That was the first thing the HOA president said when I pulled up to the gate of my family's 8,200-acre ranch. Red removal notices covered the fence. More than 300 Longhorns stood beyond it, and several had already been marked with blue paint for transport. Vanessa Cole had hired a livestock company, issued what she called an emergency removal order, and given the ranch 10 days to move a herd my family had raised since 1948. She thought I was just another ranch hand driving an old pickup. She had no idea I was Caleb Mercer, the ranch's legal heir and a former land survey technician. So I didn't yell. I photographed every notice, saved the gate camera footage, and opened the steel desk my grandfather had left behind. Inside was the original deed, decades of agricultural records, and a county map Vanessa had never seen. On the 10th morning, her livestock trailers arrived, but so did the sheriff and a county survey crew. Before sunrise, orange boundary stakes were running straight through the HOA's own parking lot. 11 months earlier, I had left Texas to settle my grandfather Walter's medical affairs and estate. After he died, I spent months sorting through legal documents and deciding whether I was ready to come home for good. Mercer Ranch had belonged to our family since 1948. I expected dust, broken fence posts, and a mountain of paperwork when I returned. I did not expect an HOA president waiting at my gate. Vanessa stood beside a white SUV with 2 security guards behind her. Red notices covered the wooden entrance sign, including one pasted directly over the Mercer cattle brand. "Tell the owner the deadline doesn't change because he finally decided to show up," she said. I stepped out of my pickup and looked beyond her. Several Longhorns had blue marks painted across their backs. Someone had already entered the pasture and selected animals for removal. "What authority do you have to touch livestock on this ranch?" I asked. Vanessa tapped her clipboard. "The board has already decided. The cattle violate community safety standards, create a nuisance, and damage property values. They leave by Friday." I asked whether she had spoken to the owner. She looked at my faded work shirt and muddy boots. "I'm speaking to the ranch staff now." Then she turned toward the guards and ordered them to photograph the gate. "My name is Caleb Mercer," I said. "Walter Mercer was my grandfather." Her smile disappeared. "I own this ranch." For a moment she said nothing. Then she recovered, pulled a red notice from her folder, and held it out to me. "Ownership doesn't exempt you from community standards." I took the paper without answering. As her SUV disappeared down Mercer Lane, Hank Lawson came out of the barn. Hank had managed the ranch for 26 years. He knew every fence line, every water tank, and almost every animal by sight. He watched the road until Vanessa was gone. "They've already hired the trucks," he said. Hank told me the trouble had started 6 months earlier, shortly after Walter entered the hospital. First came nuisance complaints about dust, flies, and cattle noise. Then came drones over the pasture, demands to move the eastern fence, and warnings that the herd was damaging the value of the luxury homes next door. Walter ignored them. He said they could complain until the cows learned to read, Hank told me. We walked toward the main herd. Near the water trough stood Moses, the oldest Longhorn on the ranch. My grandfather had raised him from a calf, and his bloodline traced back through decades of Mercer cattle. This was not an ornamental herd that could simply be loaded onto trailers and forgotten. The cattle kept the land in active agricultural use. They supported 6 local families, including Hank's, and they were tied to the last promise I had made my grandfather before he died. I would keep the ranch working. Hank stopped beside the eastern pasture and pointed toward the Silver Ridge clubhouse in the distance. 2 weeks ago, one of Vanessa's people asked me something strange, he said. What did he ask? He wanted to know how long the ranch could go without livestock before the county stopped recognizing it as active agricultural land. I looked at the blue mark on Moses' side. The HOA did not simply want the herd gone. They wanted the land to become something else. Back in the ranch office, I spread every removal notice across my grandfather's desk. The documents looked official from a distance. Up close, they fell apart. The so-called Emergency Livestock Abatement Order had no county seal, no agricultural official's signature, and a case number that did not match the county filing system. 2 notices were dated before my grandfather died, but both had been mailed weeks afterward to a house everyone knew was empty. Then I called the livestock company named on the blue tags. The dispatcher confirmed that Vanessa had hired 3 trailers to arrive at 6 o'clock Friday morning. According to the paperwork she had submitted, the HOA had legal control over the eastern portion of the ranch and permission to remove more than 300 animals. I asked the dispatcher to email me a copy of every document Vanessa had provided. Next, Hank removed the memory card from a trail camera near the eastern pasture. The footage showed Vanessa, 2 security guards, and a livestock contractor entering through a section of fence that had been cut and wired back together. They photographed the cattle, painted blue marks on selected animals, and measured the ground beside the HOA's access road. Then Vanessa stepped close enough for the camera microphone to capture her voice. "Once the animals are gone, the land classification changes," she said. "After that, the owner won't have much choice." I replayed the sentence twice. This had never been about noise, safety, or property values. The cattle removal order was part of a land deal. I did not call Vanessa to argue. I copied the footage onto 3 separate drives. I photographed every red notice and documented the cut fence, tire tracks, and livestock markings. Then I opened a notebook and built a timeline beginning with the day my grandfather entered the hospital. By noon, Vanessa emailed me what she called a voluntary compliance agreement. The HOA offered to erase every fine if I removed the herd, allowed monthly inspections, and agreed not to challenge a future zoning review of the eastern pasture. There was also one carefully worded condition. I had to waive any claim connected to HOA representatives entering the ranch. I read that sentence twice. Then I replied, "Please confirm that these are the board's complete terms." She confirmed it. Her email joined the rest of the file. While Hank checked the eastern fence, I searched my grandfather's office for old surveys. Most drawers held feed invoices, veterinary records, and handwritten grazing logs. But the bottom drawer of his steel desk would not open. Taped beneath it was a small brass key. A faded label hung from the ring. Eastline. Originals. I unlocked the drawer. Inside was a long metal map tube and an envelope with my name written in my grandfather's hand. The letter inside was short. "Caleb, if they ever come for the east pasture, do not argue at the gate. Open the records. The land will speak for itself. Walter." Inside the metal tube were the original 1948 deed, decades of agricultural use records, a county plat, and the agreement that allowed Silver Ridge residents to use Mercer Lane. The ranch had never joined the HOA. More importantly, the access agreement gave Silver Ridge only a limited right to use the road for ordinary residential traffic. It did not authorize construction vehicles, commercial expansion, or any claim over the surrounding property. That mattered because Hank had logged months of heavy equipment traveling toward the clubhouse. Beneath the agreement were 6 offers from the developer to purchase 420 acres along the eastern boundary. My grandfather had rejected every one. The final offer contained a handwritten note. "They need the cattle gone before they can call this residential land." I unfolded the county plat across the desk. The eastern property line ran beside Mercer Lane, crossed the Silver Ridge entrance monument, and continued beneath the area where the HOA had recently expanded its clubhouse parking lot. I checked the measurements again. If the original boundary markers still matched the recorded plat, Part of the HOA's newest construction was not beside our ranch. It was on it. The next morning, I took the deed, access agreement, and plat to the county records office. I expected confirmation that Vanessa had no authority over my cattle. I did not expect the clerk to study the map and say, "Mr. Mercer, you may have a much bigger problem than livestock." Her name was Maria Ortiz. Maria had worked in county records for nearly 20 years. She remembered my grandfather, and she remembered the disputes surrounding Silver Ridge. We placed the original plat beside the HOA subdivision map, then compared both with the tax parcels, building permits, drainage plans, and recorded easements. The first problem appeared at Mercer Lane. Silver Ridge had widened the road beyond the access corridor granted by my grandfather's agreement. Its entrance monument and utility enclosure crossed onto ranch property. Then Maria checked the clubhouse coordinates. She measured them twice. 63 feet, she said. The clubhouse's western wall, part of its parking lot, and several utility lines sat 63 feet inside the Mercer boundary. The HOA had recorded an amendment, claiming my grandfather transferred that strip of land years earlier. At first glance, the signature looked like Walter's, but the date stopped me. He had supposedly signed the amendment on the same afternoon he underwent emergency surgery. Hospital records showed he had been under anesthesia for more than 6 hours. The notary was connected to one of Vanessa's development partners. Maria lowered her voice. If this was knowingly recorded with a false signature, this is no longer an HOA misunderstanding. It may be a fraudulent filing. She pulled another folder from the planning archive. Inside was a map labeled Silver Ridge, Phase 3. The proposal showed 74 luxury homes, an artificial lake, a clubhouse extension, and an expanded access road. All of it depended on 420 acres of my eastern pasture. Across the bottom of the planning summary was one sentence. Existing agricultural use must be terminated before conversion approval. The Longhorns were not the problem. They were the last legal obstacle. The deeper I looked into Phase 3, the clearer Vanessa's motive became. The development proposal promised 74 luxury homes, a private lake, and what it called uninterrupted heritage ranch views. Silver Ridge planned to sell the image of my family's land while destroying the working ranch that created it. A consulting company tied to Vanessa's husband would receive a large fee once the project was approved. That afternoon, Ruth Bell called me. Ruth had lived in Silver Ridge since the first homes were built. Her late husband had worked for the original developer, and she had kept copies of several internal presentations. We met at a roadside diner outside town. She slid a folder across the table. One page showed an aerial photograph of my eastern pasture divided into future building lots. Another listed the livestock removal order as the final step before rezoning. The last slide said, "Livestock removal is the final obstacle to land conversion." While I read it, Vanessa was posting about me in the Silver Ridge residents group. She called me an absentee owner, an irresponsible rancher, and a threat to neighborhood children. She claimed I was refusing a lawful safety order because I cared more about cattle than families. I saved every post. Then a meeting notice appeared in my inbox. Vanessa had scheduled an emergency HOA session for the next evening. The agenda contained one item: final authorization for livestock removal and property control. Ruth looked at the notice and shook her head. She thinks no one will challenge her. I closed the folder. Good, I said. Let her say everything in front of witnesses. The Silver Ridge clubhouse was packed when I arrived. Vanessa stood behind a polished table with the board seated beside her. I took a chair near the back, still wearing the work shirt and boots I had worn at the ranch. She began by calling the cattle an immediate threat to public safety. Then she claimed my grandfather had voluntarily placed the eastern pasture under HOA authority years earlier. According to Vanessa, I had abandoned the property, ignored repeated warnings, and forced the board to take emergency action. I let her finish. When the floor opened for questions, I stood. "Can you show us the agreement Walter Mercer signed?" Vanessa lifted the recorded amendment from her folder. She read the date aloud. I knew that date well. My grandfather had spent that entire afternoon unconscious during emergency surgery. I did not reveal it yet. Instead, I asked, "Did you authorize anyone to enter Mercer Ranch and mark privately owned cattle?" Vanessa glanced toward the board. "Yes," she said. "I authorized it personally under our emergency powers." "And did you hire the livestock company?" "I did." Several residents began whispering. I asked one final question. "Does Phase 3 depend on removing agricultural use from the eastern pasture?" Vanessa's expression tightened. "This meeting is not about development." She quickly called for a vote. The board approved the removal operation for 6 o'clock Friday morning, the 10th day of their deadline. As people stood to leave, Vanessa looked at my dusty clothes. "Your employer should have sent someone with actual authority." The room went quiet. I held her gaze. He did. Outside, my phone vibrated with the livestock company's schedule. 3 trailers, 2 security vehicles. Arrival time, 6 a.m. Vanessa had just admitted everything in front of witnesses. Now all I had to do was let her follow through. The next morning, I sent copies of the deed, trail camera footage, disputed amendment, and Vanessa's recorded statements to the sheriff's office, county recorder, and agricultural enforcement division. I also hired a licensed survey crew to be at Mercer Ranch before sunrise on Friday. Then Vanessa sent her final offer. A company I had never heard of would purchase the 420-acre eastern pasture for less than half its appraised value. If I accepted, the HOA would cancel every fine and withdraw the livestock removal order. The company's registered address matched the office used by Vanessa's husband. That email connected the cattle order directly to the development deal. I forwarded it to the sheriff. My only reply to Vanessa was, "I'll be at the gate on the 10th day." She answered with one sentence, "Then be prepared to cooperate." Hank and I spent Thursday checking the fence, charging every camera, and making sure the herd stayed in the western pasture. We did not block the road or set any traps. I replaced the lock Vanessa's people had damaged and hung a new sign beneath the Mercer brand. Private ranch. Entry requires written permission. At 5:42 the next morning, headlights appeared at the far end of Mercer Lane. The trailers had arrived. 3 livestock trailers stopped outside the gate just before 6. 2 security vehicles followed, then Vanessa's white SUV. Several Silver Ridge residents had come behind them, expecting to watch the HOA take control of the ranch. Vanessa stepped out holding the removal order. "Your deadline has expired," she said. "Open the gate." I remained on my side of the fence. "You do not have permission to enter this property." She raised the paper as though it settled everything. "The board authorized emergency access." I pointed toward the cameras mounted above the gate. "I am telling you clearly, no one has permission to cross this line." Vanessa turned toward the head of security. "Cut it!" He hesitated, then placed bolt cutters around the chain. The lock snapped and fell into the dirt. I did not touch him. I did not raise my voice. The gate camera recorded Vanessa waving the first trailer forward. Its front wheels had barely crossed the property line when 2 sheriff's vehicles appeared behind the convoy. Sheriff Boone stepped out and ordered every engine shut down. Vanessa hurried toward him. "Sheriff, this man is obstructing a lawful HOA operation." She handed him the amendment carrying my grandfather's signature. I opened the metal map tube and spread the original deed, agricultural use records, access agreement, and preliminary survey across the hood of Boone's vehicle. Then I showed him the trail camera footage, Vanessa's offer to cancel the removal order if I sold the pasture, and the recording from the HOA meeting. The livestock company manager reviewed both sets of documents and immediately pulled his drivers back. "We're not touching those animals," he said. A county survey truck arrived minutes later. The crew located the original boundary monuments and began placing orange stakes. The first appeared beside the ranch gate. The next landed beyond the Silver Ridge entrance sign. Then the line continued through the edge of the clubhouse parking lot. Vanessa insisted the survey was wrong. The survey chief checked his equipment and looked toward Sheriff Boone. The deed, tax parcel, and original monuments all agree. Behind us, the 3 empty livestock trailers began turning around. Not one Longhorn had moved. The survey chief pointed toward the clubhouse. "This is more than an access violation," he said. "Their building is on Mr. Mercer's land." An emergency meeting began less than 2 hours later inside the same clubhouse, now marked by orange survey stakes. Sheriff Boone stood near the door. Maria brought certified county records. Ruth sat in the front row with the Phase 3 presentation resting on her lap. Vanessa tried to dismiss the survey as a mistake, so I presented the evidence in order. First, the 1948 deed showed that Mercer Ranch had never joined Silver Ridge. Second, decades of agricultural records proved that the cattle operation existed long before the HOA. Third, the so-called emergency removal order had never been issued or approved by the county. Then I played the trail camera footage of Vanessa entering the pasture and marking my Longhorns. Her voice filled the room. "Once the animals are gone, the land classification changes." No one spoke. Maria placed the recorded amendment beside my grandfather's hospital records. The document claimed Walter had signed away the eastern boundary while he was unconscious in surgery. Ruth stood and handed each board member a copy of the Phase 3 presentation. The final slide read, "Livestock removal is the final obstacle to land conversion." Vanessa blamed the developer. Then she blamed the HOA attorney. Finally, she blamed the rest of the board. That was when I played her statement from the previous meeting. I authorized it personally. That ended the argument. Sheriff Boone announced that the county was investigating possible fraudulent filing, criminal trespass, property damage, and attempted unauthorized removal of livestock. The board immediately voted to suspend Vanessa and freeze every payment connected to Phase 3. As a deputy escorted her outside to give a formal statement, she had to step across the orange boundary line, proving the clubhouse stood partly on my land. The room remained silent until the HOA attorney approached me. He looked toward Mercer Lane, the only legal access route serving the clubhouse, and asked the question Vanessa should have considered before touching my cattle. "What will it take for you not to close the road?" I had grounds to suspend access to Mercer Lane. The HOA had used the road to enter my property, damage my gate, and support an unauthorized development project. But most Silver Ridge residents had not known what Vanessa was doing. I had no intention of punishing them for her decisions, so I gave the board a choice. Phase 3 would be canceled. The HOA would pay for the damaged fence, the independent survey, and the legal review. Vanessa and everyone connected to the disputed amendment would be removed from authority, and an independent audit would examine every payment tied to the development plan. The HOA would also recognize the Mercer boundary in writing. No board member, contractor, or security officer would enter the ranch without written permission again. In return, I would allow residents to continue using Mercer Lane under a new and transparent access agreement. The board accepted. Over the next several months, part of the clubhouse parking lot was removed, the disputed filing was cleared from the county record, and a new HOA board was elected. The Longhorns stayed. Hank and I repaired the eastern fence and restored the old sign above the ranch gate. Mercer Ranch, Established 1948. Below it, we added a smaller sign. Private land. Good neighbors welcome. That evening, Moses walked past the spot where Vanessa's red removal notices had once covered our family brand. My grandfather used to say the land remembers who takes care of it. Vanessa believed a title and a clipboard made her powerful. But the deed remembered. The county records remembered. And the ranch never forgot who it belonged to.